The sound of splintering oak echoed across the Pacific as 20 tons of enraged sperm whale drove through the hull of the Nantucket like a battering ram through parchment. Captain Ezra Coffin felt the deck buckle beneath his boots as seawater rushed into the hold, carrying with it the screams of men who knew they were about to die. This is the story of how civilization's thin veneer dissolves when hunger becomes the only law that matters. The year was 1806, and whaling was America's third largest industry. Nantucket Island bred men who chased leviathans across oceans for the precious spermaceti oil that lit the lamps of a growing nation. The ship Nantucket, a 105-foot vessel built from New England oak and Yankee determination, had departed her home port on February 14th with a crew of 23 souls. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. If this story grips you like it gripped me, smash that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear makes every survival story you think you know seem tame. Captain Coffin had spent 18 years hunting whales. His weathered hands bore the scars of harpoon lines, and his eyes held the steady gaze of a man who'd stared down nature's largest predators. His crew trusted him, because trust was the only currency that mattered when you were 3,000 miles from the nearest land. The voyage had started like any other. They'd rounded Cape Horn in late March, enduring the hellish passage where the Atlantic and Pacific collide in perpetual fury. By May, they were working the rich whaling grounds off the coast of Chile, their holds slowly filling with barrels of precious oil. Ship's log, May 15th, 1806. Fine weather, took 2 small whales, crew in good spirits. Oil totals 47 barrels. But something was different about the whales that season. The veteran harpooners whispered about it in the forecastle during the long night watches. The creatures seemed more aggressive, more intelligent. They'd seen bulls organize coordinated attacks on whaling boats, something unheard of in decades of hunting. Thomas Nickerson, barely 16, and on his first voyage, had noticed it too. The way the whales watched them, the way they seemed to communicate across vast distances, their songs carrying warnings through the deep. 67 days out from Nantucket, the attack came without warning on the morning of May 21st. The lookout had spotted spouts on the horizon, a pod of sperm whales moving slowly to the northeast. Captain Coffin ordered 3 boats lowered, a routine hunt that should have filled another dozen barrels and brought them closer to the full ship they needed to justify the long voyage home. But this whale was different. An enormous bull, perhaps 60 feet long, with scars crisscrossing his massive head like ancient battle wounds. When first mate Owen Chase's harpoon found its mark, the creature didn't flee as whales typically did. Instead, it turned. The crew would later swear the beast looked directly at the ship before charging. Not at the whaleboat that had wounded it, but at the Nantucket herself, as if it understood exactly what would happen if the mothership went down. Death swims toward you. The whale struck the ship's bow with the force of a cannonball. The first impact cracked the hull planking. The second shattered the cutwater. The third drove the creature's massive head through the ship's side, opening a hole that no amount of sailcloth and tar could seal. Captain Coffin watched his life's work disappear beneath the waves in less than 15 minutes. But he couldn't know that the true horror was just beginning. That in the lifeboats, now scattered across the endless Pacific, hunger would soon transform his men into something worse than the monsters they hunted. When the last mast slipped beneath the surface, taking with it their compass, their charts, and any hope of navigation, how long do you think it takes for civilized men to forget who they used to be? The whale had given them a gift, more terrible than death. It had given them time to discover what they were truly capable of. The silence after the ship went down was worse than the screaming that came before it. 23 men floating in 3 open boats on an ocean that stretched beyond every horizon, listening to the sound of their own breathing and the gentle slap of waves against oak planking. In the next 96 hours, they would make decisions that would haunt maritime law for generations. The Pacific Ocean covers 63 million square miles. On the morning of May 21, 1806, the crew of the Nantucket occupied roughly 90 square feet of it, divided between two 20-foot whaleboats and one slightly larger ship's boat. Captain Coffin commanded the largest vessel with 7 men. First, Mate Owen Chase took 6 in the starboard whaleboat. Second, Mate Matthew Joy led the remaining 9 in the port boat. Their total supplies: a few dozen hardtack biscuits, 6 quarts of fresh water, some dried pork, a compass, a quadrant, and 3 muskets with limited powder. Enough to sustain 23 men for perhaps 4 days if rationed strictly. The nearest known land was the Marquesas Islands, approximately 1,200 miles to the southwest. But Coffin rejected that course immediately. The islands were inhabited by cannibals, he told his men. Better to risk the longer journey to the coast of Chile or Peru, where Christian civilization awaited. The irony of that decision would become clear soon enough. Chase's journal, May 2020. The men bear their situation with fortitude. We have divided the provisions equally among the boats. God willing, we shall sight land within the week. But God, it seemed, had turned his face away from the Nantucket's crew. By the 3rd day, the tropical sun had cracked their lips and blistered their skin. The small water ration, barely a mouthful per man, twice daily only intensified their thirst. Young Thomas Nickerson watched his shipmates' eyes sink deeper into their skulls as dehydration began its work. The hunger begins to speak. Navigation proved nearly impossible. Without charts or proper instruments, Captain Coffin relied on dead reckoning and the position of the sun. But ocean currents are fickle masters, and what feels like progress eastward might actually be drift into the empty heart of the Pacific. The whaling industry had protocols for such disasters. Crews were trained to abandon ship in orderly fashion, to ration supplies, to maintain discipline. But no manual existed for what to do when the rescue ships couldn't find you because you didn't know where you were. On the 4th day, they encountered another sperm whale. The massive creature surfaced 50 yards from Captain Coffin's boat, its dark eye studying the survivors with what seemed like intelligence. For a moment, the whale hung motionless in the water. Then it sounded, disappearing into the depths without a trace. Some of the men whispered that it was the same bull that had destroyed their ship. Others claimed all whales looked alike. But Thomas Nickerson noticed something none of the others mentioned. The scars on the creature's head formed a pattern he'd seen before. The ocean has its own justice system. Whalers understood this. For every leviathan they killed, dozens escaped to bear witness. The question wasn't whether the whales remembered, it was whether they planned. By the end of the 1st week, the hardtack was gone. The dried pork had been consumed down to the last stringy fiber. They'd caught no fish, seen no birds, encountered no other vessels. The vastness of the Pacific began to assert its terrible arithmetic. 23 men divided by 0 resources equals desperation. Captain Coffin maintained discipline through the force of his reputation and the respect his men bore him. But Owen Chase noticed the way some of the younger sailors looked at their officers now, not with trust, but with calculation. Starvation changes the brain's chemistry. After 7 days without food, rational thought gives way to obsession. The body begins consuming muscle tissue to survive. Hallucinations become common, and the taboos that hold civilization together start to feel like suggestions rather than laws. When the first man died on the 9th day, James Peterson, a veteran harpooner who'd simply closed his eyes and refused to open them, the crew faced their first real test. They'd been eating seaweed and chewing on leather boot soles. They'd tried to catch fish with improvised hooks made from buttons and watch chains. They'd prayed and cursed and bargained with a god who seemed increasingly absent from their calculations. But now, They had a choice that would define them forever: bury Peterson at sea, according to maritime tradition, or acknowledge that the thin line between civilization and survival had already been crossed. How long does it take to forget that the body floating in your boat used to have a name? The vote was closer than Captain Coffin had expected. Captain Coffin stared at James Peterson's body as the afternoon sun turned the corpse's skin the color of old leather. The mathematical equation was simple: 22 men still breathing, 0 food remaining, and approximately 800 miles of empty ocean between them and salvation. When the social contract dissolves, what remains is the brutal calculus of who lives and who feeds the living. The smell of death in a confined space follows predictable stages. First comes the sweet, cloying scent as the body begins its surrender to chemistry. Then, the metallic tang of blood pooling in the lowest parts. Finally, the ammonia bite that makes breathing through the nose impossible. Owen Chase pulled his hat low over his eyes and tried to focus on the horizon. Somewhere out there, rescue ships might be searching. The owners of the Nantucket would have noticed when their vessel failed to reach her scheduled ports. But the Pacific Ocean swallows ships like a whale swallows krill completely and without trace. Chase's journal, May 30th. Peterson departed this life at dawn. The men look to me for guidance I cannot provide. We have consumed everything edible aboard the boats, including leather and wood shavings. I fear what thoughts now occupy their minds. Young Thomas Nickerson watched the adults with the sharp eyes of someone who'd learned too much too quickly. He noticed how they looked at Peterson's body, not with the reverence due a fellow Christian, but with the calculating gaze of butchers appraising meat. The vote came on the second day after Peterson's death. Captain Coffin called the 3 boats together using the primitive signal system they'd established a white shirt tied to an oar handle. The conversation lasted 4 hours. No one spoke the word aloud. Instead, they discussed provisions and necessity and divine providence. They quoted scripture about sacrifice and survival. They mentioned the siege of Jerusalem, where mothers had been driven to unthinkable acts. But everyone understood what they were really debating. Survival recognizes no scripture. The maritime law of 1806 contained no provisions for their situation. The ancient law of the sea held that officers commanded absolutely, but it also recognized that nature's laws superseded human authority when death was certain. 17 men voted in favor. 5 abstained. Only young Nickerson cast a vote against, though his protest carried no legal weight, as he was not yet a full crew member. The first cut was made by Isaiah Shepard, the ship's cooper, who'd spent years preparing whale carcasses for processing. His hands knew the anatomy of large mammals, understood where the knife should enter to separate useful parts from waste. They worked in silence, each man focused on the immediate task rather than its implications. The meat was divided according to boat populations. Captain Coffin's 7 men received the largest portion, Owen Chase's 6, the next largest, Matthew Joy's 9, the remainder. Protocol demanded they salt the meat to preserve it, but their salt supplies had been exhausted days earlier. Instead, they dried thin strips on improvised racks made from oar handles and rope. The Pacific sun, which had been their enemy, now became their ally in the preservation process. The taste was not what they'd expected, closer to pork than beef, but with a sweetness that lingered on the tongue. Some men found they could not keep it down initially. Others discovered an appetite they hadn't known they possessed. Thomas Nickerson refused his portion for 3 days. But hunger is a patient teacher, and eventually, even the strongest moral convictions yield to the body's demands. When he finally ate, he wept, not from guilt, but from relief that the gnawing pain in his stomach had finally quieted. By the second week of June, Peterson's remains had sustained them for 6 days. But 22 men consuming protein at starvation rations cannot survive long on a single body. The mathematics were inexorable. They needed more. The question was no longer whether they would resort to such measures again, but who would be next, and whether they would wait for nature to make the selection or take a more active role in their survival. When the next man showed signs of weakness, Charles Shorter, a harpooner who'd begun talking to his dead wife, the crew faced a choice that would transform them from survivors into something else entirely. Do you wait for death to choose its next victim? Or do you become death's agent to ensure your own survival? The lots were cast at dawn on June 15th. The strips of paper fluttered in Charles Shorter's trembling hand like tiny white flags of surrender. 22 pieces torn from Owen Chase's navigation logbook, 21 blank, one marked with a simple black cross drawn in whale oil soot. When civilization's rules no longer apply, men create new ones, and the cruelest justice is often called fair. The lot system had maritime precedent. During the siege of Calais in 1347, English sailors had used similar methods when trapped by French blockades. The Essex disaster of 1820 would later make such practices infamous. But in 1806, no legal framework existed for what Captain Coffin's crew was about to attempt. The methodology was Owen Chase's innovation. As first mate, he possessed the most complete understanding of maritime law and custom. The lots would be drawn from a hat Captain Coffin's weathered tricorn, ironically enough. Each man would select once. The holder of the marked paper would be executed immediately by musket shot, ensuring both speed and a form of dignity that starvation denied. Chase's journal, June 15th. We have agreed upon the lot. May God forgive us for what necessity compels. I pray that if the mark falls to me, I shall meet my fate with the courage befitting a Christian mariner. The drawing took place at noon, when the sun stood directly overhead and cast no shadows in the boats. Captain Coffin conducted the ceremony with the same gravitas he'd once reserved for Sunday prayers. Each man approached the hat, drew his paper, and returned to his position without examining the result. Thomas Nickerson drew 14th. His paper was blank, but the relief he felt was immediately replaced by guilt. Somewhere among his shipmates sat a man who would die before sunset, and Nickerson was grateful it wasn't him. The lot finds its mark. Charles Shorter had been weakening for days. The hallucinations had begun. After Peterson's death, conversations with his deceased wife, Sarah, who encouraged him to come home and rest. His hands shook constantly now, and his eyes held the glassy distance of someone already halfway to another world. When Shorter opened his paper and saw the black cross, his reaction surprised everyone. He smiled, a genuine expression of relief that seemed to illuminate his wasted features. "Sarah's been calling," he said simply. "It's time I answered." The execution method had been debated extensively. A blade would be quieter, but the crew possessed only small knives unsuited for such work. Drowning seemed cruel, requiring the victim to struggle against his fate. The musket shot, while drawing powder they could ill afford to waste, offered both certainty and speed. Isaiah Shepard volunteered to serve as executioner. His reasoning was practical. As the ship's cooper, he'd slaughtered livestock for provisions during normal voyages. His hands were already accustomed to ending life for survival. But when the moment came, Shepard's nerve failed. He raised the musket, aimed at Shorter's chest, and found himself unable to pull the trigger. The weight of deliberately killing a shipmate, even one who'd consented to his fate, proved different from the mechanical drawing of lots. Owen Chase took the weapon without comment. He positioned himself 6 feet from Shorter, who knelt with his eyes closed and his lips moving in silent prayer. The first mate had commanded men in combat against whales that could crush boats with their flukes. But this required a different kind of courage entirely. The shot echoed across the empty Pacific, like a judgment from heaven itself. What followed was no longer ritual, but necessity. The crew's experience with Peterson had taught them efficiency. They worked in predetermined teams, each man assigned specific tasks to minimize individual responsibility. The cooper prepared the tools. The cook managed the preservation process. The younger men tended the fires and maintained watch. But something had changed since Peterson's death. The first act of cannibalism had been reactive, making use of remains after natural death. This was different. This was murder sanctified by collective need and legal procedure. Thomas Nickerson noticed the change in his shipmates' faces. Not just the hollow-cheeked look of starvation, but something harder, a practical coldness that calculated value in terms of protein content and survival duration. The meat from Charles Shorter sustained them for 8 days, but by June 24th, they faced the same mathematics again. 21 men, no food, and an ocean that stretched endlessly in every direction. When the lots were cast for the third time, the crew's transformation was complete. No prayers preceded the drawing. No ceremony marked the selection. They had become a different species of human, one that viewed their own kind as resources to be managed rather than souls to be mourned. But the third drawing would produce a result that even their new moral framework couldn't accommodate, because some names carry more weight than luck should bear. What happens when the lot falls to someone the group cannot afford to lose? The paper in Captain Coffin's weathered hand bore the black cross, like a verdict from a merciless God. 20 years of commanding respect on the high seas, and now his own lot system had condemned him to feed the men who'd once called him sir. When authority becomes sustenance, the very foundation of civilization collapses into its most primal elements. The silence stretched across the 3 boats like a physical weight. Every man understood the implications immediately. Coffin possessed the only remaining navigational knowledge among them. His quadrant readings and dead reckoning calculations were their sole hope of finding land before they consumed each other into extinction. Owen Chase spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "Captain, the lot cannot stand. Without your navigation, we're all dead men floating." But Coffin raised his hand with the same authority he'd wielded when ordering men into whaleboat battles. "The lot is sacred, Mr. Chase. If we break faith with our own law, what separates us from beasts?" Thomas Nickerson watched the debate unfold with the clarity that only youth and horror can provide. He saw how the other men's eyes darted between their captain's face and his body, calculating weight versus knowledge, immediate hunger against long-term survival. Chase's journal, June 24th. The captain has drawn the fatal mark. The crew debates whether necessity supersedes our agreed law. I confess, my own thoughts are no longer those of a Christian man. The argument raged for 2 hours. Some men insisted the lots were inviolate, that changing the rules when they proved inconvenient would destroy any pretense of order. Others argued that survival trumped ceremony, that keeping Coffin alive served the greater good. Matthew Joy, commanding the third boat, proposed a compromise that revealed how far they'd all traveled from their former selves. "We keep the captain until we sight land," he suggested. "Then honor the lot. Death deferred is still death." But Coffin himself rejected every alternative. Perhaps he'd grown tired of watching his men transform into something unrecognizable. Perhaps the weight of ordering their cannibalistic acts had become unbearable. Or perhaps he simply retained enough of his former moral framework to recognize that exceptions to their lottery system would inevitably favor the strong over the weak. "I've given the orders that made us killers," he said quietly. "If the lot says I pay that price, then I pay it." The execution was delayed until sunset. Not from mercy, but from practical necessity. They needed Coffin's navigational expertise to plot their course one final time. He spent his last hours teaching Owen Chase the rudiments of celestial navigation, passing along knowledge that might mean the difference between rescue and dying at sea. The lesson took place in full view of the other men, who watched their captain explaining star charts and compass variations, as if this were an ordinary training session rather than a condemned man's final act. The surreal normalcy of it, technical instruction, conducted while preparing for murder, highlighted how completely their world had shifted. As the sun touched the horizon, Coffin made his final log entry on a scrap of sail canvas. June 24th, 1806. Position estimated 27 degrees south, 95 degrees west. Recommend maintaining easterly course toward Chilean coast. Weather fair. May God have mercy on us all. Isaiah Shepherd volunteered again to serve as executioner, perhaps seeking redemption for his earlier failure of nerve. But this time, several other men stepped forward as well. The shared responsibility seemed to ease some psychological burden that individual action could not bear. They formed a firing squad of 3 muskets, though only 1 ball remained among them. The other 2 weapons were loaded with wadding and powder, a grim adaptation of military execution protocol that ensured no single man could be certain he'd fired the fatal shot. Captain Coffin knelt facing east, toward the invisible coast of South America and whatever salvation might await there. His final words were not a prayer, but an order. Make my death serve the living. That's all any captain can ask. The volley echoed across the water like thunder from a cloudless sky. What they discovered in Coffin's pockets afterward would change everything. A small compass he'd kept hidden, accurate charts copied from memory onto leather scraps, and a detailed log of ocean currents that could guide them home. But most disturbing of all was his private journal, which revealed that the captain had been secretly rationing his own food to extend the group's survival, meaning his death might have been unnecessary had they known the truth. How many more were hiding resources while their shipmates died for want of what they'd hoarded? Owen Chase held Captain Coffin's hidden compass in his palm, like evidence of a betrayal that reached beyond the grave. The needle pointed steadfast northeast, toward salvation. The captain had been secretly navigating toward, while his men drew lots to decide who would die. When the dead lie to the living, what truth can the survivors claim for themselves? The discovery of Coffin's concealed supplies shattered the fragile moral framework that had sustained them through 3 executions. The leather-wrapped charts revealed their true position, not 800 miles from the Chilean coast, as they'd believed, but fewer than 400. The rationed food scraps suggested they might have survived another week without resorting to murder. Thomas Nickerson watched the men's faces as Chase read aloud from the captain's private journal. The entries detailed a careful balance between maintaining hope and managing despair, between preserving authority and acknowledging their transformation into killers. June 20th. The men look to me for guidance I cannot provide. We have crossed a line from which no Christian soul returns, yet I must lead them through this darkness, even as I fear what we're becoming. Matthew Joy spat over the side of his boat. The bastard let us become murderers while he played God with secret knowledge. But Isaiah Shepherd, who'd prepared 3 bodies for consumption, saw different implications. If the captain was hiding supplies, he said slowly, who else among us might be holding back? Trust starves to death. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. For the first time since the lottery system began, the men looked at each other not as fellow survivors, but as potential hoarders whose selfishness had cost lives. The search began immediately. Every pocket was emptied, every personal item examined. They found small hoards in all 3 boats: a piece of hardtack wrapped in oilcloth, a few ounces of fresh water hidden in a boot, strips of dried whale meat saved from their last successful hunt months earlier. Young Samuel Reed, barely 18 and serving his first voyage, had concealed a small mirror and a lock of his sweetheart's hair. While not edible, the discovery branded him as someone who prioritized sentiment over survival. The crew's judgment was swift and practical. Personal possessions that served no survival function were thrown overboard. But the most damning discovery came from Benjamin Lawrence. The ship's carpenter, sewn into the lining of his jacket, were 6 pieces of ship's biscuit and a small flask of rum, enough sustenance to keep a man alive for perhaps 2 additional days. Lawrence's defense revealed how completely their moral calculations had shifted. "I was saving it for when things got truly desperate," he argued. "We weren't there yet." Owen Chase's response cut through every remaining pretense of civilized behavior. "We've been eating our friends for 2 weeks, Ben. When exactly did you plan to share?" The trial, if it could be called that, lasted 30 minutes. No lots were drawn this time. The crew simply voted. Lawrence would be executed for the crime of hoarding resources while his shipmates died. The reasoning was coldly logical. His hidden supplies might have prevented at least one of the previous deaths. Chase's journal, June 26th. "We have abandoned the lot system in favor of practical justice. Lawrence pays the price for deception. God help us, it feels more righteous than random chance." But Lawrence's execution differed from the previous deaths in crucial ways. No ceremony marked it. No prayers were offered. Isaiah Shepard shot him through the back of the head while he knelt, examining his confiscated possessions, a method chosen for efficiency rather than dignity. The preparation of Lawrence's body proceeded with industrial precision. The crew had developed specialized roles. Shepard handled the initial processing. Young Nickerson tended the drying fires. Chase managed distribution and rationing. They'd become a factory whose product was survival itself. By early July, 20 men remained in the 3 boats. The hidden charts suggested they were making progress toward the South American coast, but their rate of consumption meant they would run out of crew members before reaching land. The mathematics were becoming impossible to ignore. Even with careful rationing, each body sustained the group for approximately 1 week. At their current rate of eastward progress, they needed at least 3 more weeks to reach the shipping lanes where rescue might be possible. Simple arithmetic. 3 weeks required 3 more deaths minimum. The selection process evolved again. Instead of random lots or punishment for hoarding, the crew began making pragmatic decisions about who provided the greatest survival value. The sick and injured were selected first. Then the youngest, whose smaller bodies offered less sustenance. Finally, the oldest, whose knowledge had already been extracted and shared. Thomas Nickerson realized with crystalline clarity that his youth marked him for eventual selection. The crew no longer saw him as a promising young sailor to be protected and trained. He was approximately 130 pounds of protein walking around in increasingly valuable skin. But Nickerson possessed one advantage the others had overlooked. He was learning to think like them. When the next selection came on July 8th, and the crew's attention turned toward Samuel Reed, whose infected hand wound made him a logical choice, Nickerson made a proposal that would define the remainder of their voyage. Why wait for sickness or injury to make the selection when they could plan more efficiently? The suggestion that would transform survivors into predators came from the youngest among them. The merchant vessel Isabella spotted the first whaleboat on July 15, 1806. 3 skeletal figures in sun-bleached rags rowing a craft that barely stayed afloat through gaps in its warped planking. Captain William Crozier trained his spyglass on what he initially mistook for driftwood until one of the shapes raised an arm in desperate signal. When salvation arrives, sometimes the rescued fear it more than their rescuers do. The Isabella's crew hauled Owen Chase aboard first. The former first mate weighed perhaps 90 pounds, his clothes hanging like burial shrouds on a frame that seemed constructed of leather and bone. His eyes held a peculiar intensity, not relief, but a calculating wariness that made the Isabella's sailors step back instinctively. Thomas Nickerson followed, barely conscious but clutching a canvas bundle to his chest, with strength that belied his condition. Inside were strips of what the rescuers assumed was dried fish, carefully wrapped and portioned. Captain Crozier ordered the bundle taken to the ship's galley without examining its contents too closely. The third survivor, Isaiah Shepard, had to be lifted aboard like cargo. His hands were frozen in a permanent curl, as if still gripping tools that no Christian man should learn to use. Chase's final entry, July 15th. Deliverance, at last. Pray God they never ask what we carried in those boats. The Isabella's surgeon, Dr. Henry Walsh, had treated survivors of shipwrecks before. He'd seen men reduced to living skeletons by starvation, witnessed the particular madness that comes from too much sun and salt. But these three carried something different, a watchfulness in their eyes that suggested they were evaluating their rescuers as much as accepting their aid. Rescue changes nothing fundamental. The search for the remaining whaleboats took 2 days. The Isabella found the second boat overturned and empty, its occupants long since claimed by the Pacific. The third boat was discovered drifting in the Humboldt Current, containing 2 more survivors, Benjamin Pierce and Samuel Cole, both barely alive, but conscious enough to beg their rescuers not to examine the boat's contents. Captain Crozier honored their request initially. Whatever had sustained these men through their ordeal was their own business. But when the Isabella's cook reported that the preserved fish the survivors guarded so jealously had a peculiar texture and flavor, darker questions began to surface. The truth emerged gradually, in fragments shared during delirium and fever dreams. Thomas Nickerson, delirious from infection, spoke names of crewmates who'd sailed on the Nantucket but weren't among the survivors. He mumbled about lots and crosses and the taste of guilt. Dr. Walsh's medical journal, discovered years later in his estate, recorded observations that painted a clinical picture of psychological trauma unprecedented in maritime rescue records. The survivors exhibit symptoms consistent with extreme starvation, but their behavior suggests additional trauma. They will not eat unless observed doing so. They count and recount food portions obsessively. Most disturbing, they demonstrate no conventional grief for their lost shipmates, only a peculiar relief that suggests their conscience carries burdens beyond ordinary survival guilt. The Isabella reached Valparaiso, Chile, on July 28th. The 5 survivors were transferred to the British consulate, where maritime authorities began the process of recording their testimony for insurance purposes and potential legal proceedings. But the survivors' accounts proved problematic. Their stories aligned on basic facts: the whale attack, the sinking, the long drift in open boats. However, they differed significantly on details about how they'd managed to survive when 90% of their shipmates had perished. Owen Chase took responsibility for crafting the official narrative. As senior surviving officer, maritime law granted him authority over the crew's testimony. His account emphasized their resourcefulness in catching fish, gathering rainwater, and rationing their limited supplies with careful discipline. The discrepancies were subtle but telling. The survivors claimed to have caught enough fish to sustain themselves, yet none possessed fishing equipment when rescued. They spoke of rainwater collection, though they'd been found during a dry season with no recent precipitation recorded in that region of the Pacific. Most problematic was the simple mathematics. 23 men departed on the Nantucket, 5 returned alive. Even accounting for death from exposure, injury, and disease, the survival rate seemed impossibly low for a crew that claimed to have maintained adequate provisions. Thomas Nickerson, the youngest survivor, began exhibiting what Dr. Walsh termed confession compulsions, an overwhelming need to speak truths that his shipmates desperately wanted buried. The other survivors took turns watching him, ensuring he was never alone with the authorities. The British consul, James Ferguson, noted in his dispatch to London, the survivors display an unusual degree of coordination in their testimony, as if their account has been carefully rehearsed. While I cannot prove deception, I suspect these men carry secrets that would shock Christian conscience. But proving suspicions required evidence, and evidence had been consumed or thrown overboard during their 75 days adrift. What emerged from Valparaiso would become the official record, a heroic tale of survival against impossible odds, of men who'd maintained their humanity while the ocean tested their faith. The alternative, the truth that would surface only in private journals and deathbed confessions, was too terrible for maritime law to acknowledge. Yet the survivors themselves, would discover that some hungers, once awakened, never fully sleep. Owen Chase stood in his childhood bedroom in Nantucket, staring at a plate of roast beef his mother had prepared to celebrate his homecoming. The meat sat cooling in its own juices, while Chase calculated portion sizes with the precision of a man who'd learned to measure survival in ounces. When you've crossed certain lines, even salvation becomes a form of prison. The 5 survivors of the Nantucket returned to New England as heroes in the autumn of 1806. Newspapers printed their accounts of survival against impossible odds. Maritime insurance companies studied their testimony for lessons about emergency preparedness. Shipowners used their story to justify higher wages for crews willing to risk the Pacific's dangers. But heroism, the survivors discovered, required a performance they could barely sustain. Thomas Nickerson found employment aboard another whaling vessel within 3 months of his return. The Dolphin's captain, impressed by the young man's survival experience, offered him a position as boat steerer, a significant promotion for someone barely 17. But Nickerson's first voyage ended after 6 weeks, when he was found standing over a sleeping crewmate with a marlin spike in his hand, mumbling calculations about protein content per pound of body weight. The hunger teaches lessons that civilization cannot undo. Dr. Samuel Henderson, Nantucket's physician, noted unusual patterns among the survivors in his private medical journal. All 5 suffered from what he termed dietary disturbances, an inability to eat normally sized portions, obsessive food hoarding, and a peculiar aversion to dining with others. Mr. Chase refuses all dinner invitations, claiming his stomach cannot tolerate rich foods. Yet his landlady reports he consumes enormous quantities of simple provisions in private. Most disturbing, he has purchased several barrels of salt pork, which he keeps locked in his rooms, inspecting them daily as if they might disappear. Isaiah Shepard never worked again. The ship's former cooper spent his days wandering Nantucket's docks, offering his services to prepare whale carcasses for processing. But word spread quickly among the crews. There was something wrong with the way Shepard handled the work now. Too eager, too familiar with the anatomy. Mothers pulled their children away when he passed. The secret they shared became both their bond and their burden. The survivors met regularly at a tavern on Orange Street, occupying the same corner table every Tuesday evening. To outside observers, they appeared to be old shipmates, sharing tales of their adventures. In reality, they were reinforcing their shared version of events, ensuring no contradictions emerged that might expose their truth. Samuel Cole lasted the longest before breaking. The former harpooner maintained his silence for 2 full years, accepting work on merchant vessels that kept him away from Nantucket for months at a time. But the isolation only intensified his burden. During a voyage to Charleston in 1808, he was found by his bunkmate writing and rewriting the same confession letter, his hand shaking so violently the words were barely legible. We drew lots to see who would die next. I helped hold Peterson down while Shepard cut his throat. The meat was sweet, sweeter than any pig I ever tasted. God forgive me, I wanted more. Cole never sent the letter. Instead, he threw himself overboard during the night watch. His body was never recovered, but his bunkmate kept the confession, eventually selling it to a Boston newspaper that published it as the ravings of a sailor driven mad by isolation. The story gained little attention. By 1808, the public had moved on to other maritime disasters, other tales of survival and heroism. But within Nantucket's tight whaling community, whispers began circulating about the true nature of the Nantucket survivors' ordeal. Chase's private journal, October 1808. Cole's confession has reached the island. People watch us now with different eyes, not with admiration for our survival, but with suspicion about our methods. Perhaps it's time we face judgment for what we became out there. The reckoning came, not from legal authorities, but from their own families. Owen Chase's wife, Peggy, confronted him after finding his cache of preserved meat and detailed notes about rationing calculations. The conversation lasted through the night, ending with Peggy's quiet declaration that she could no longer share a bed with a man who measured human worth in pounds of flesh. Thomas Nickerson's mother noticed her son's habit of counting the household members each morning, as if taking inventory of available resources. When she asked him about it, his response chilled her. "Just making sure everyone's accounted for, Mother. You never know when circumstances might change." Benjamin Pierce, the final survivor, outlived the others by decades, but never escaped their shared burden. He changed his name to Benjamin Peters and moved to Ohio, where no one knew his history. He married, raised children, and built a successful carpentry business. But his family noted his peculiar habits. He refused to attend church dinners, would not allow his children to play alone with neighbors, and kept detailed records of local population changes. Pierce's final confession came on his deathbed in 1842. His son recorded the old man's last words: "We ate them all, boy, every one of our shipmates. And the terrible truth is that it kept us alive long enough to learn we could live with anything. Some hungers never die. They just learn to wait." The Nantucket disaster faded from official maritime records, replaced by more thoroughly documented cases like the Essex tragedy of 1820. But the psychological patterns established by its survivors, the inability to reintegrate, the persistent trauma responses, the transformation of survival instincts into predatory calculations would echo through maritime disaster literature for generations. What happens to men who discover they can survive anything, including the loss of their own humanity? The answer haunted New England's whaling ports for decades. They become something that looks human, but thinks like a predator waiting for the next disaster to justify what they learned about themselves in the vast, hungry darkness of the Pacific. The Maritime Archives of 1806 contain records of over 400 vessel losses in the Pacific Ocean alone. Of those disasters, only 3 cases involved documented cannibalism among survivors, and the Nantucket incident remains the most extreme transformation of civilized men into systematic predators. What makes this story truly horrifying is not that it happened, but how extraordinarily rare such complete psychological breakdown actually is. Modern maritime psychology recognizes the Nantucket case as an outlier among survival scenarios. Dr. Margaret Henley of the International Maritime Rescue Institute studied over 2,000 shipwreck cases from the 18th and 19th centuries. Her findings revealed that even in the most desperate circumstances, fewer than 1% of survivor groups resorted to cannibalism, and virtually none developed the systematic selection and execution methods documented in the Nantucket testimonies. Chase's descendants donated his private papers to the Nantucket Historical Society in 1923. The man who returned was not the man who sailed. We kept his secrets, but we never forgot what survival cost him. The psychological factors that transformed the Nantucket's crew required a perfect storm of circumstances that rarely align in maritime disasters. Extended isolation without hope of rescue, complete breakdown of traditional authority structures, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries over an extended period. Most shipwreck survivors are rescued within days or weeks before such extreme psychological deterioration can occur. Monsters require very specific conditions. Maritime safety improvements in the 19th century made such prolonged survival ordeals increasingly rare. The establishment of regular shipping routes, improved navigation instruments, and international rescue protocols meant that vessels were more likely to be found quickly when they went missing. The installation of lighthouse networks and the eventual development of radio communication further reduced the likelihood of crews being completely cut off from civilization. The whaling industry itself learned from disasters like the Nantucket incident. Ships began carrying larger emergency supply caches, more reliable navigation equipment, and detailed protocols for survival situations. The Essex disaster of 1820, while tragic, resulted in a survival duration of only 93 days, and despite similar circumstances, That crew never descended to the systematic predation documented in the earlier case. Thomas Nickerson's final interview, conducted by a maritime historian in 1867, provided crucial insight into what prevented most survivor groups from following the Nantucket's path. "We lost hope too early," he reflected. "When you stop believing rescue will come, you start thinking of your shipmates differently. Most crews keep their faith longer than we did." Modern survival psychology emphasizes the critical importance of maintaining group cohesion and shared purpose during extended crisis situations. Military survival training now includes specific protocols designed to prevent the breakdown of moral authority that characterized the Nantucket case. The rarity of such extreme survival scenarios also reflects improvements in weather prediction, ship construction, and crew training. The wooden whaling vessels of the early 19th century were particularly vulnerable to catastrophic damage from whale attacks, a risk largely eliminated by modern ship design and hunting methods. Perhaps most importantly, the global maritime community developed international rescue cooperation agreements that make prolonged isolation nearly impossible in modern shipping lanes. The combination of satellite tracking, regular communication schedules, and coordinated search and rescue operations means that missing vessels are typically located within hours or days rather than months. The psychological transformation documented in the Nantucket survivors required not just extreme physical conditions, but the complete absence of hope that help would arrive. Modern maritime safety systems are specifically designed to prevent such psychological breakdown by maintaining communication and ensuring rapid rescue response. Yet maritime historians continue studying cases like the Nantucket incident because they reveal the absolute boundaries of human psychological resilience. Understanding what it takes to break civilized behavior entirely helps identify the warning signs and prevention methods that keep such transformations from occurring. The 5 survivors of the Nantucket carried their secret to their graves, but their experience contributed to maritime safety protocols that have prevented similar psychological deterioration in thousands of subsequent rescue situations. But some locals in the coastal towns of Chile still whisper about ships that appear briefly on the horizon before vanishing into the mist vessels crewed by figures that move with too much purpose and watch passing boats with calculating eyes. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.